The Afghan War cost the US $2.3 trillion, and the Iraq War $1.79 trillion. The Iran War has cost so far around $40 to $50 billion, which includes war repair and replacement costs alongside general operational expenses. The US government does not increase taxes or establish a war fund to cover these huge war expenses. The government and taxpayers have not yet paid the bill for even the Afghan and Iraq wars. So this video explains how the US economy works, how it manages to cover huge war expenses, how costly a war it can fight without an economic crisis, and whether there is any stopping point or limit to managing war expenses. The US military's main budget is always insufficient to cover war expenses, as this budget covers predictable expenses such as salaries, weapons procurement, training, maintenance, and research and development. When a war or emergency breaks out, the military needs money quickly that is not planned for in the regular yearly budget. The president tells Congress exactly how much money is needed and why. Congress takes that request and turns it into a bill. Because it is framed as an urgent emergency, these bills are usually fast-tracked and passed. This money is used to cover war expenses. The interesting part is that the US government does not typically raise taxes or cut other programs to pay for the war at the time it is fought. So the real question is, where does this money come from? The US government often spends more money than it collects in taxes. During wars, that gap becomes much bigger, because wars are extremely expensive. In 2025, without any major war expenses, total federal spending was $7.01 trillion, while total federal revenue through taxes was $5.23 trillion, giving rise to a total federal deficit of $1.78 trillion. So imagine the gap between expenses and revenue during wars. Whenever the US government needs more money or needs to cover war expenses, it does not print more money, but instead borrows money. Because simply printing money causes inflation. The US does not ask the IMF or foreign countries. It simply issues Treasury bonds. Investors and banks buy these bonds to earn profit in the form of interest. If there are no buyers in the market, the Federal Reserve, which prints dollars, steps in and buys the bonds and credits the government's account. It is like printing new money, but under a different label, and it is considered less inflationary than simply creating new money. The money the government receives in exchange for bonds is actually debt, and it has to repay it with interest. This creates the US federal debt, which has soared to $40 trillion, the highest debt ever held by any country, which is even more than the US GDP of $31.2 trillion. Clearly, US government revenue is roughly only 12% of this massive debt, so it cannot repay it. The issued bonds regularly mature, and the US regularly sells new bonds, meaning it repays old debt with new debt. The debt works in a cycle and continues throughout the year. Since the government also has to pay interest on bonds, that is what creates the real burden. The interest now amounts to $1 trillion in budget expenses, consuming 15% of the US federal budget and gradually surpassing the defense budget, turning short-term war spending through deficit financing into a prolonged burden. The Afghan and Iraq wars have ended, but their cost has never ended and will continue to appear in the US debt for an indefinite period. The Afghan War, which ended with a $2.3 trillion price tag, is estimated to actually cost $8 trillion by 2050, including interest. The US government has endless money to fight a war, as there is no limit to its deficit financing by issuing bonds and receiving money in exchange for bonds. The initial cost of the war creates no problem for the US, but the problem arises from structural long-term pressures when the government pays interest on its debt. Also, a high debt relative to GDP could drive investors away from buying US bonds, as they worry the country will not be able to repay them with interest. The US has the Federal Reserve, which can buy indefinitely large amounts of bonds, but it has to print new money to do so, which causes inflation in some ways as it puts new money into the market. The US needs existing money from investors in the market to receive in exchange for bonds to avoid inflation. Investors' money provides the discipline and stability that keeps the US dollar a reliable global currency. So, when the US fights a war, it does not pay today but continuously pays for it in the future for an indefinite period of time. There is no magic number to show how expensive a war the US could manage without harming its economy. The debt itself does not create a problem as long as the US economy is in good condition. The problem arises when the debt reaches comparatively higher than the GDP and the government finds it difficult to pay the interest.